Everyone is watching the missiles. Nobody is watching what the missiles are landing next to. Because if you understand what that location means, religiously, historically, and right now, militarily, this entire war looks completely different. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is what actually happened. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. Within hours, Iran fired back, and one of those missiles, or what remained of it after interception, came down at a place called Sultan's Pool, an outdoor venue in Jerusalem, just a few dozen meters from the walls of the old city, less than 1 kilometer from the Temple Mount. That is a confirmed fact, reported by Israeli police, confirmed by the Times of Israel. Now here is what most people missed. That spot sits right next to 3 of the most sacred locations in the entire world: the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Al-Aqsa Mosque. One missile fragment landing in the wrong direction could have changed everything. And here is the part nobody is really explaining: why that specific location matters so much more than the missile itself. The conflict between Israel and Iran on the surface looks like a military story. Strikes, counter-strikes, drones, defense systems lighting up the sky. But underneath that, there is something much older, much deeper, and much harder to explain in a 2-minute news segment. There are 2 things happening right now that the mainstream coverage keeps treating as separate stories, but they are not separate at all. The first is what is happening in the sky. Missiles, military bases, are the Strait of Hormuz shutting down, oil prices spiking. The second is what is happening on the ground, specifically on one small hill in the middle of Jerusalem that has been at the center of conflict for over 1,000 years. These 2 stories are connected, and when you understand how this whole situation hits differently. So let us start with the thing that most people have never actually had explained to them properly. There is a small hill in the middle of Jerusalem. It covers about 35 acres. That is roughly the size of 26 American football fields placed side by side. And right now, that hill is at the center of everything. It goes by 2 names depending on who you ask. Jews call it the Temple Mount. Muslims call it Haram al-Sharif, which means the noble sanctuary. Both names, same place. And that right there tells you everything you need to know about why this location is so complicated. Here is the history, and this part matters. The Temple Mount is considered the holiest site in Judaism. According to Jewish tradition, it is where the first and second temples once stood. The second temple, the one that stood during the time of Jesus, was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE during their siege of Jerusalem. That destruction happened almost 2,000 years ago. And Jews have been facing that direction in prayer ever since. The Western Wall, the lower section of the compound's retaining wall, is the only physical remnant of that temple that survived. It has served as a site of Jewish pilgrimage ever since that destruction. So, when you see people praying at the Western Wall, pressing their hands against those ancient stones, that is not just ritual. That is 2,000 years of longing compressed into one wall. But now, here is where it gets more complicated. Sitting right on top of that same hill, the Temple Mount, is the Al-Aqsa compound. It is considered the 3rd holiest site in all of Islam. According to Islamic tradition, this is the site where the Prophet Muhammad was miraculously transported one night from Mecca to Jerusalem, and from there taken up to heaven. So for Muslims, this is not just a mosque. This is the place where heaven and earth connected. And here is the thing nobody explains clearly enough. The compound is a 35-acre site that includes the Al-Aqsa Mosque itself and the Dome of the Rock. Its courtyard can hold more than 400,000 worshippers at one time, making it one of the largest places of worship anywhere on Earth. 2 of the world's largest religions, one hill, one piece of ground, both with claims that go back over 1,000 years. Now you start to understand why every single thing that happens here, every missile, every restriction, every prayer, carries weight that goes far beyond politics. But here is what is happening right now that has lit a fuse nobody is talking about enough. Since February 28, 2026, when US and Israeli strikes against Iran began, Israeli authorities have kept Al-Aqsa Mosque closed. the longest such closure since 1967. Think about what that means. This has been the first Ramadan since Israel seized East Jerusalem in 1967 that Palestinians have been unable to perform Friday prayers at the mosque. Ramadan is the holiest month in the Islamic calendar, and the final 10 nights of Ramadan, including the Night of Power, are considered the most sacred nights of the entire year. Last year alone, approximately 180,000 worshippers attended the night prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque during that same sacred night. This year, the compound stood completely empty. Worshippers gathered in the streets outside, spreading prayer mats on the ground outside the old city walls because they had nowhere else to go. And the reaction across the Muslim world has not been quiet. The Arab League called it an unprecedented provocation to the feelings of nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide and a direct assault on freedom of worship. 8 Muslim-majority nations, including countries widely seen as Israel's closest partners in the region, condemned the closure and called on Israel to lift restrictions immediately. That last part is important. Even Israel's allies are speaking out. Now, here is what most people still have not connected. This closure is happening at the exact same time that missiles are flying, and one of those missiles landed less than 1 kilometer from this compound. We do not know exactly where the next one lands, and that uncertainty, that is what nobody wants to say out loud, because if that changes, everything changes. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that most people are completely missing. Because while everyone is watching missiles fly over Jerusalem, there is something happening on the other side of the map that could hit every single person watching this video directly in their wallet. And it is already happening. Look at a map of the Middle East. Find the thin strip of water sitting between Iran and Oman. It is called the Strait of Hormuz, and it is probably the most important stretch of water on the planet right now. Here is why. In 2024, an average of 20 million barrels of oil passed through that strait every single day. That equals roughly 20% of all the petroleum the entire world consumes. 20 million barrels every day through one narrow waterway. And the strait is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is the distance between some American cities and their suburbs. And through that gap flows 1/5 of the world's oil supply. But it is not just oil. Around 93% of Qatar's and 96% of the UAE's liquefied natural gas exports move through the Strait of Hormuz. Together, that represents nearly 20% of all the liquid natural gas traded globally. Now here is where it gets personal for everyday Americans and people watching from around the world. When oil supply gets squeezed, everything gets more expensive. Not just gas at the pump. Think about what runs on fuel. Trucks that move food to grocery stores, factories that make packaging, farms that use fertilizer, much of which comes from natural gas, plastics, medications, diapers, cosmetics. According to current tracking data, oil prices have already spiked to around $119 a barrel since the conflict escalated, up from $57 per barrel at the start of 2025. That is more than double in less than 3 months, and here is what is already happening on the ground right now. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been severely curtailed since the conflict began. At least 16 vessels in the region have been struck by drones or other weapons. Iraqi oil production from its main southern oil fields has already dropped by 70%, falling to just 1.3 million barrels per day, because Iraq currently cannot export oil through the strait. That is not a future scenario. That is already happening. But here is the part that almost nobody is connecting. Iran itself is still moving its own oil through the strait, in almost the same volumes as before the war started, while blocking or threatening everyone else. Think about what that means strategically. Iran is using the strait as a pressure point, blocking others, keeping their own exports flowing, earning the money they need to continue. Iran is also reportedly considering allowing a limited number of tankers to pass through, but only if the oil is traded in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. That one detail alone is worth paying attention to, because it is not just about oil. It is about who controls global trade and in what currency. Now think about the countries most exposed to all of this. Asian countries collectively receive nearly 90% of all the crude oil and condensate that moves through the Strait. China, India, Japan, South Korea. And here is the connection to something most people have not thought about. Those countries, particularly Taiwan and South Korea, manufacture the vast majority of the world's semiconductors, the chips that go into phones, cars, laptops, AI data centers, medical equipment. No oil, no chips, no phones, no AI, no modern supply chain. We are not talking about inconvenience here. We are talking about a chain reaction. And right now, that chain has already started moving. But there is one more layer to this that connects everything. The missile strike, the mosque, the Strait, and something much bigger that has been quietly building for months. And that is what we need to look at next. So now we need to talk about the thing that connects all of this together. The missile, the closed mosque, the Strait. They all point back to one central issue that has been building quietly for decades, and most people have no idea it even exists. Here is a question most people cannot answer. Why does it matter so much, specifically, that Al-Aqsa Mosque sits where it sits? The answer goes back almost 2,000 years. The first temple, built by King Solomon, stood on the Temple Mount for over 400 years before it was destroyed by the Babylonians around 587 BCE. The second temple stood in the same location for another 400 years before the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE. After that destruction, Jews were scattered across the world. And for nearly 2,000 years, that hill sat under the control of others. The desire and belief in a third temple, a rebuilt house of worship on that exact same site, is a deeply held conviction in Judaism, particularly in Orthodox Jewish tradition. Jewish prophets wrote about its construction as part of the Messianic Age, the era when peace would finally come to the world. And here is where it gets complicated in a way that directly connects to what is happening right now. On August 4th, 2025, a significant date in the Jewish calendar, the Temple Institute, a Jerusalem-based organization, publicly declared it was time to build the third temple. They cited spiritual and prophetic readiness. Now, what exactly has the Temple Institute actually done? This is important to get right. The Temple Institute has already created over 60 sacred temple vessels that would be needed for worship in a rebuilt temple. This includes the high priest's breastplate, musical instruments, and priestly garments. They also claim to have located red heifers, animals used in ancient Jewish purification rituals, which some religious authorities consider a necessary prerequisite before temple service can resume. A detailed architectural scale model of the third temple, built at 1/50th of actual size, has already been completed and is viewable at a visitors center in Jerusalem. The design is 150 meters long and 150 meters wide. These are verified, documented preparations. They are not secret. They are publicly displayed. But here is what is equally important to say clearly. There is no active, large-scale construction of a third temple happening right now. What exists is a smaller ecosystem of preparatory work, ritual objects, priestly training, architectural models, and political advocacy carried out by religious organizations and activist groups. A rabbi writing in the Times of Israel just weeks ago made this point directly. Jewish tradition does not say to simply start building a temple tomorrow. There are significant religious and legal preconditions that most Jewish authorities say have not yet been met. So to be precise, this is not a construction story. Not yet. It is a preparation story, and the preparations are real, documented, and accelerating. Now here is where this becomes relevant to everything happening right now. The central problem, the one that sits at the heart of this entire conflict, is geography. The site where Jewish tradition says the third temple must be built is the exact same site where Al-Aqsa Mosque currently stands. Since October 2023, Israeli authorities have significantly increased Jewish access and presence at the Temple Mount through controlled visitation, sparking deep concern among Palestinians and Muslims that the site is being gradually reconfigured. Now add missiles landing less than 1 kilometer away. Add the first closure of Al-Aqsa during Ramadan since 1967. Add 8 Muslim nations, including Israel's closest regional partners, publicly condemning what is happening at that site. And now ask yourself this question. What happens to all of that tension if something changes, even accidentally, at that location? We are not saying it will happen. We are not predicting anything, but the conditions that would make it possible have never been more concentrated in one place at one time than they are right now. And there is one more layer to this story that almost nobody is talking about. It is not about Jerusalem. It is not about Iran. It is about what is happening to the alliances that have held this region together for decades. That is what comes next. Now here is where this story stops being just a Middle East story, because what is happening right now, quietly behind closed doors, involves some of the wealthiest nations on Earth reconsidering relationships they have held for decades, and it directly affects the United States. Most people think of Saudi Arabia and the UAE as rock-solid US allies, countries that buy American weapons, countries that host American bases, countries that have been in Washington's corner for decades. That picture is changing, and the speed at which it is changing should get your attention. And according to a report from the Financial Times on March 5th, 2026, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar have begun an internal review of existing and future financial agreements with Washington, including examining whether legal clauses exist that would allow them to suspend those contracts entirely. Think about what that means in practical terms. During President Trump's Gulf tour in May 2025, these same nations pledged hundreds of billions of dollars in US investments. Those agreements are now under quiet but serious scrutiny. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Now being reviewed, but it goes even deeper than money. By January 2026, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and even the UAE, widely seen as Israel's closest partner in the region, had all stated they would not allow the United States to use their airspace to conduct strikes on Iran. Read that again slowly. America's closest Gulf allies, countries that host US military bases, said no to Washington. And a survey that helps explain why this is happening found something remarkable. A survey of 40,000 individuals across 15 Middle Eastern countries found that 77% of respondents said US policies now threaten regional security and stability. 77% across 15 countries. That is not a fringe opinion. That is a regional consensus. Now here is what makes this even more complicated. It is not just that these countries are pulling away from the US, they are also fracturing among themselves. The historically close alliance between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two countries that have operated as a unified front for over a decade, is now under serious strain because of fundamentally different foreign policy directions. The breaking point came on December 30th, 2025, when Saudi Arabia conducted airstrikes targeting a UAE-linked weapons shipment in Yemen, a direct military action between two countries that are supposed to be allies. Saudi Arabia, striking a UAE-linked target. These are not enemies. These are supposed to be partners. And yet here we are. Now layer on top of that what is happening to their actual economies. On March 2nd, 2026, Iranian drones struck Saudi Aramco's largest domestic refinery, a facility that processes 550,000 barrels of oil per day. The attack was confirmed by Saudi defense officials. On the same day, Iranian forces also struck Qatar Energy's operating facilities at two major industrial cities, directly targeting the infrastructure that Qatar depends on to export its natural gas to the world. Qatar has no alternative export route. Every drop of its natural gas must pass through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no backup plan. And here is what one of the Gulf's most prominent businessmen said publicly in an open letter just days ago. Khalaf Ahmad al-Habtour, one of the UAE's most influential billionaires, publicly asked who gave you the authority to drag our region into a war with Iran. That is not an activist. That is a billionaire businessman who has spent his entire career building ties between the Gulf and the West, saying publicly that something has gone too far. When the people who have the most to lose from instability start speaking out, that is a signal worth paying attention to. So let us step back and look at what we actually have right now. Missiles landing near the most contested religious site on Earth. A mosque closed during the holiest month of the year for the first time since 1967. The world's most important waterway effectively blocked. Gulf allies reviewing hundreds of billions in US commitments. And fractures opening inside alliances that have held together for decades. Each of these stories gets reported separately, as if they have nothing to do with each other, but they are all connected. And there is one final layer, one that most coverage does not go near, that ties all of this together into something much larger. That is what we need to look at next. Now here is a layer most news coverage will not touch, not because it is not real, but because it requires sitting with something uncomfortable. The people making decisions in this conflict, on multiple sides, are not just thinking about oil fields and missile trajectories. Some of them are thinking about something much older than that. Let us start with what is documented and verified. Before Israel launched its first strike on Iran in June 2025, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited the Western Wall in Jerusalem. He placed a handwritten note between the ancient stones. His office later released the message. It read, "The people shall rise up as a lion." That is not a military briefing. That is scripture from the Book of Numbers, chosen deliberately, released publicly. A US ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee sent President Trump a message before the strikes, later published by the White House, urging the president to listen to the heavens when deciding how to proceed. He wrote that God had saved Trump to be the most consequential president in a century. Now, whatever your personal beliefs, these are documented facts about how some of the most powerful decision-makers in this conflict are framing their choices. That matters, regardless of where you stand. And it is not just government officials. Since the strikes on Iran began on February 28, 2026, a military watchdog group called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation reported over 200 complaints from service members across multiple branches of the U.S. armed forces, alleging that commanders told troops the war with Iran was part of a divine plan. Those complaints have not yet been verified by the Pentagon. That is important to say clearly. But the volume, over 200, is itself a documented fact. One prominent religious scholar described a growing attitude among some communities as a kind of spiritual eagerness for conflict in the Middle East, rooted in the belief that such a war would set off a sequence of historically significant events. Now here is where this gets nuanced, and it is important to be precise. Not all Christians, not even most Christians, share this view. Russell Moore, editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, wrote directly in response to the conflict that we cannot track prophetic timelines based on the bombing schedules of Israel or Iran. He cautioned against tying ancient prophecy to current geopolitical events in ways that leave people terrified and then exhausted. That is a significant voice pushing back on the apocalyptic framing. Historians also point out that some of the specific end times frameworks being applied to this conflict have roots not in ancient scripture alone, but also in a 19th century American theological movement. So when you hear these frameworks applied to current events, it is worth understanding where they actually came from. But here is what nobody disputes, from any tradition or none at all. The International Atomic Energy Agency formally declared Iran in breach of its nuclear non-proliferation obligations in June 2025. Israeli intelligence assessed Iran was close to completing multiple nuclear weapons. That assessment directly triggered the military strikes. What followed, the 12-day war of June 2025, ended in a US-mediated ceasefire. But the February 2026 escalation has pushed the situation significantly further. So you have a verified nuclear threat, a verified military escalation, a verified dimension influencing decision-makers at the highest levels, and a verified missile that landed less than 1 kilometer from the most contested religious site on Earth. Whether you are religious or not, those four facts sitting in the same place at the same time, is extraordinary. And it raises a question that most people have not fully sat with yet. If this situation escalates further, and the location everybody is circling gets hit, what actually happens next? That is not a rhetorical question. There is a documented answer, and it is not what most people expect. So here is the question. Every analyst, every diplomat, and every government right now is trying to answer. Where does this go from here? And for the first time, there are enough verified facts on the table to actually look at that question honestly. Let us start with what has already happened, because most people still do not have the full picture. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched nearly 900 strikes in just 12 hours. The targets included Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and senior leadership. The opening wave of strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of other Iranian officials. That is not a small military operation. That is one of the largest single-day strike campaigns in modern history. Iran responded within hours, launching missiles and drones at Israel, at US military bases across the region, and at US allied countries throughout the Persian Gulf. The attacks left more than 2,000 people dead across Iran, Lebanon, and Israel, and displaced hundreds of thousands more, and it has not stopped since. Now here is what the analysts are actually saying. RAND experts assessed that for Israel, Iran has represented the ultimate strategic threat for years. A country with thousands of ballistic missiles that had repeatedly called for Israel's destruction while funding and arming proxy groups. The strikes, according to RAND, could buy Israel several years of relative quiet. But here is the part that complicates that conclusion. Atlantic Council analysts pointed out directly that there is an assumption in Washington that Iran will stop fighting when the US and Israel decide they want to end this war. That assumption, they say, is almost certainly wrong. From Iran's perspective, a ceasefire right now would just be a temporary break before the US and Israel restart the conflict once they have restocked their weapons. So Iran's intended outcome appears to be a slow, drawn-out war of attrition, one designed to exhaust the United States and destabilize the Gulf economically. That is not speculation. That is the documented strategic assessment of some of the most respected defense analysis institutions in the world. Now here is what makes the next phase so unpredictable. A question is now circulating openly among policymakers and analysts. What if Iran's new leadership decides that this war actually provides an opportunity for a nuclear breakout? There is no public evidence that Tehran has made that decision. But Iran still possesses large quantities of highly enriched uranium. And the political constraints that once limited its nuclear ambitions may have fundamentally shifted, especially following the death of the supreme leader who had long maintained a religious prohibition on nuclear weapons. That is the scenario nobody wants to say out loud. Legal and security analysts have pointed out that even if only one side in a future confrontation possesses nuclear weapons, that situation alone could still inflict enormous harm, and Iran could theoretically seek to involve already nuclear states as partners. We are not saying that is going to happen. The analysts themselves are not saying it is going to happen. But the fact that it is now being discussed openly in peer-reviewed legal journals, in parliamentary briefings, in defense think tanks, tells you something about how serious this moment actually is. The Gulf International Forum put it this way: the most serious consequences of this war will not occur on the battlefield. They will occur in the economic, diplomatic, and strategic realignments that follow. And here is what that means for ordinary people right now. The UN World Food Programme has already warned that this escalation is driving significant long-term increases in global food prices. To nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports, both critical components of agricultural fertilizer, pass through the Strait of Hormuz. A near-total halt of tanker traffic there has already begun threatening global food security. This is not a future warning anymore, it is already in motion. So step back and look at everything we have covered. A 900-strike opening salvo, a supreme leader killed, a strait effectively closed, food prices rising globally, Gulf alliances fracturing, a new Iranian leadership with potentially different nuclear calculations, and a missile that landed less than 1 kilometer from the most religiously contested site on Earth. Each of these things is documented, verified, happening right now. And there is one final piece, the one thing that ties all of this together, that we have not fully addressed yet. It is not about missiles. It is not about oil. It is about a question that has been sitting underneath this entire conflict from the very beginning. And it is the question that nobody is willing to ask directly. So here is the question nobody is asking directly. Not the analysts, not the governments, not the news networks covering this every day. And it is actually the most important question of all. Was any of this avoidable? Here is what the verified record shows. On February 25, 2026, just 3 days before the strikes began, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated publicly that a historic agreement with the United States to avert military conflict was within reach. On February 27th, 1 day before the strikes, Oman's foreign minister described a breakthrough. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium. Iran had agreed to full verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran had agreed to irreversibly downgrade its existing uranium supplies. Peace, he said, was within reach. Talks were scheduled to resume on March 2nd. The strikes began on February 28th. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres addressed the Security Council directly and said the joint military operation had squandered an opportunity for diplomacy, occurring in the middle of active indirect negotiations between the US and Iran, mediated by Oman. The International Crisis Group, one of the world's most respected conflict analysis organizations, described the operation as sweeping and noted that much of the world had predicted this crisis was coming. Now, that does not mean the concerns about Iran's nuclear program were not real. They were documented, verified. It's serious, but what the record also shows, clearly, is that a diplomatic path existed, and it was abandoned 3 days before it was supposed to resume. A senior foreign policy analyst writing for War on the Rocks put it this way: the choice facing the United States was not between war and peace. It was between two different pathways into the same conflict. That framing is important, because it means the question of how this ends is just as complicated as the question of how it started. The International Crisis Group assessed this week that neither side is positioned for a decisive win. Iran has settled in for what it believes can be a long war of attrition. The US and Israel have dealt significant damage, but Iran has already elevated a new supreme leader, closed ranks, and expanded the conflict rather than retreating from it. As of this week, President Trump said publicly he is not prepared to reach a deal with Iran, while simultaneously urging other countries to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. That is where things stand right now, today. So bring it all the way back to the beginning. A missile, a closed mosque, a blocked strait, a broken negotiation, a new supreme leader with no known constraints on nuclear weapons, and a hill in Jerusalem where the eyes of billions of people are watching every single development with a level of attention the world has not seen in a generation. Each piece alone is a major story. Together, they are something else entirely. And right now, as of this week, the war is still expanding. Israeli strikes are growing, the shipping stranglehold on the Strait is persisting, and the world is waiting to see what move comes next. Nobody has a clean answer yet, but here is what is certain. The next 30 days will determine whether what we are watching right now stays a regional conflict or becomes something that changes the map of the world permanently. And there is one specific event, one location, one decision. That could tip it either way overnight. We told you what it is at the very beginning of this video. Now you know exactly why it matters.